Thank you for joining me on this trip through one of the scariest cases in history. There is a story that can't be explained logically that takes place deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where thick fog mixes with old secrets. A story that has been passed down from generation to generation and is still only told by people who are brave enough to remember. It is not true that this movie was made. It was just made for fun. Any resemblance to real people, live or dead, is just a coincidence. It was 1904, and the Appalachians were in the background. It stood as a natural wall between the developed world and the parts of the United States that haven't been visited yet. Back then, going through those heights meant going on narrow trails that led to dangerous drops, and being completely alone, which is something that only mountains can do. Small towns were spread out in deep valleys, and the only way for them to talk to each other was through messengers who risked their lives on trips that could last days. Thomas McAllister was a well-known person in Virginia's Wise County. He worked as a surveyor for companies that wanted to make maps of mountainous areas. This was a dangerous job that required a lot of courage and understanding of the paths that were in danger. Thomas made the people who hired him feel confident. He was tall, had broad shoulders, and a deep look, but there was something about him that some people in the area didn't like. It could have been the way he moved through the forest in quiet, or the way he seemed to know every tree and rock. It was like the mountains were telling him secrets that no one else could hear. During that year's harsh winter, a series of strange events began to shake up the peace of the small towns that were spread out along the hillsides. People who traveled along the old trade routes said they felt strange things like being watched, hearing footsteps behind them even when they stopped to listen, and seeing fresh tracks in the snow that didn't look like those of people or animals they knew. The older people talked in a low voice about old stories that went back to when. The first residents had to deal with both wild animals and something darker that lived in those mountains. Thomas was the only one who really knew these stories. He kept a very detailed journal during his expeditions. In it, he wrote down not only measurements and coordinates, but also strange observations, like clearings where plants grew in perfect circles, caves that he had never been able to fully explore, and the remains of buildings that didn't look like they were built by natives or colonists. These notes were found. Decades later, a forgotten trunk showed a man who was obsessed with solving mysteries that most people would rather not think about. Things changed in March of that year. Thomas got a strange offer to map a certain area in the mountains that no one lived there, and about which scary stories were going around. The business that hired him gave him a lot of money, more than he would make in months of regular work. Even though the money was appealing, he was driven by something else. He wrote about it in his book. A meeting he had weeks before with an old mountaineer who told him about impossible finds in that forbidden area. Before he left, Thomas went to the nearby pub, where he often met other mountain workers. That night, people who saw him said he seemed different and incredibly restless. He talked about finally being able to show that the stories were true, and that those hours held secrets that would change everything people knew about the area. Some laughed, while others. They looked away in an awkward way, but one man told him not to go. He said that place had a name from long ago, the Valley of Silence, because not even the birds would sing there. The next morning, Thomas left at dawn, taking with him his measuring tools, food for 2 weeks, and the notebook that would be found many years later. The path he took was called the Black Cliff Path, and it wound its way up between deep gorges. They last saw him alive when they were cutting wood near the beginning of the path. His story goes that Thomas stopped for a moment, looked back as if to remember the view of the valley below, and then vanished into the mossy trees. The days turned into weeks, and Thomas still hadn't come back. His absence didn't set off any alarms right away because he often went on long trips for work. But when it had been a month with no news, people became worried. The business that hired him put together a search team with seasoned hunters and guys who had grown up in the mountains. They went after the same path Thomas had taken, going into more and more rural areas. They were shocked by what they found in the first few days. Thomas's camp was still set up in a space with all of his tools and food still in order, but the man was no longer there. There were no signs of a fight, an animal attack, or a physical altercation. He seemed to have just risen and walked into nothing, leaving everything behind. Even more unsettling was the diary that was lying open on a flat stone, dated 1 week after he left. The last thing Thomas wrote in his book made the people on the search team very scared. He talked about finding something strange, like buildings that didn't make sense and were set up in ways that suggested they had a purpose and were intelligent. He said that he could hear sounds coming from deep inside the earth, like the rock was breathing. On the last line he wrote, "They knew I would come. Now I see what has always been here." Day after day, people searched, exploring every part of that area. They found marks on trees that looked like they were made by tools but didn't match any known instrument. The tracks they followed led nowhere. In 1904, there weren't many ways to do investigations, so those men depended only on their gut feelings and past experiences. The thing that bothered them the most was the complete silence in that area. There were no animal sounds or bird songs. There was only the wind rustling through the old trees. One of the searchers, who had been on many trips before, through the Appalachians, he was sure he saw something that made him doubt his own mind. While they were sleeping that night, the group woke up near Thomas's empty camp and felt like they were being watched. He looked into the dark forest and saw what he called shadows moving in a strange way, sliding between the trees without making any noise. When he told them in the morning, some of them laughed nervously, but others said they had felt the same way. The search was now over. Called off after 3 weeks. Thomas McAllister was reported missing by the police in Wise County. He was most likely killed in an accident in the dangerous mountains. His things, including the disturbing notebook, were given to his family in a bigger town to the east. But that wasn't the end of the story. Over the next few months, more strange things started to happen in the area. People who were traveling through the area near the Valley of Silence said they had scary experiences. Some people said they saw a single figure watching from the heights that were always too far away to clearly see, but went away when they tried to get closer. Others said they found Thomas's personal items strewn around in strange places miles away from where his camp had been found. It was still a mystery how these things got there. In June of that year, a shepherd leading his sheep along a different path found something that started the whole study over again. He found what looked like a temporary home in a secret ravine that was protected by a natural rock formation. Safety. There were signs of a recent campfire, food scraps, and, most interestingly, patterns carved into the stones around them. It wasn't clear what language the marks were from, and they didn't look like they were made by European settlers. In a hypnotic way, they were made up of complicated geometric designs. The officials were told, and plans were made for a new expedition. This time, they brought in a Georgetown professor who was interested in archaeology and of cultures. The man was very interested in the marks and thought they might be hundreds or even thousands of years old. But he felt something was wrong. Some of the marks looked like they were just redone, as if someone was keeping them out in the open to keep them from getting worn down over time. When these symbols were compared to drawings in Thomas's diary, the study became even more puzzling. In his last posts, he drew similar patterns and made guesses about what they meant. Thomas thought that the marks were some kind of map or warning that people who lived in the mountains before the colonists came left behind. He wrote about an idea that didn't make sense, that some parts of the Appalachians were hiding secrets that should stay secret. The oldest people in the area started to tell stories that had been passed down through their families for generations. They talked about a time when their ancestors had just moved to those places and made unwritten deals about what areas should never be explored. They talked about earlier. People who didn't care about these unseen lines went missing decades ago. The lives that have been lost in those mountains for a long time go back much further than Thomas. The summer came and went, and so did the search for solutions. The small mountain towns went back to their normal routines, but the case of Thomas McAllister would never be forgotten. People who were thinking about going into the most dangerous areas of the world heard his story in bars on stormy nights. In rural areas, the world went on, but something in the mountains seemed to wake up. The Appalachians are now in autumn, which means that the sides of the mountains are covered in shades of red and gold. It was a beautiful but disturbing time of year, when the shadows got longer earlier, and mist rose from the valleys like ghostly fingers. It was around this time in October 1904 that even scarier stories came in from places close to the Valley of Silence. A market, who kept a regular route between the mountain towns and brought bad news. He talked about people who had started having dreams that kept coming back and had similar parts. Dreams that a man walks through the woods over and over again, looking for something he can't find. The most disturbing thing was that people from different communities, separated by miles of rough countryside, talked about the same person in the same places. Some said they thought they saw Thomas McAllister in those nighttime pictures. Thoughts. Though Thomas's wife had stayed in Lynchburg to wait for news, she chose to make the long trip to the mountains. She had with her letters that her husband had sent in the weeks before he went missing. The letters showed that he was getting more and more upset. Thomas wrote in them that he had found references in old county records to earlier expeditions to that area, expeditions that ended in tragedy or mystery. He thought he was almost ready to understand something that linked all of those events that happened over the years. During her time in the woods, the woman insisted on going to the spot where her husband's campsite had been found. She made the difficult trip to the clearing with the help of 2 experienced guides. No one really knew what happened, but the guide said she was quiet for a long time and looked around at the scenery as if she were hearing something only she could understand. When she finally spoke, what she said was, "Strange. He's not lost. He picked to stay." The guides tried to figure out what she meant by those words, but she wouldn't say more. She picked up some rocks from the area and dirt from where Thomas's tent had been set up. Then she asked to be taken back. Before she went back to Lynchburg, she spent a lot of time talking with the oldest people who lived there, and asked them about local tales and the history of the mountains before the settlers came. What she learned from these. Talking to people changed her in a clear way, making her quieter and more thoughtful. At the same time, the Georgetown expert who had looked at the symbols in the ravine came back with better tools and a helper. They spent weeks writing down not only the marks, but also interesting geological facts about the area. They found that this area had strange magnetic properties that made their measure tools and compasses spin around in circles and make strange patterns. It looked like there were also rock shapes to have been planned, but it was hard to tell when this happened with the tools available at the time. The scholar's young assistant, who was interested in strange things that don't make sense, started to put together all the stories of disappearances and strange events that have happened in the Appalachians over the last 100 years. He found a trend that was very disturbing. About once every 10 years, someone goes missing in that area, and the circumstances are always the same. There were people who went to the Valley of Quiet to find something that was driven by interest or the hope of finding something useful just vanished, leaving behind only personal items and unanswered questions. Even older papers were found in the Wise County records, which were kept in a damp basement of the local government building. It was said that early farmers and a group of Native Americans who still lived in the mountains at the time made an unofficial deal in 1820. The deal was never written down, but was told from person to person. Generations said that some places should stay unchanged. Native Americans would show the settlers the safest ways to get around and teach them about the area in exchange. Over the years, most people forgot about this deal. Because new generations didn't know why their ancestors had warned them not to go there, they started to explore areas that had been avoided before. Thomas McAllister wasn't just an interesting researcher. He was the last in a long line of travelers who, whether they knew it or not, pushed those old limits, and something in the mountains reacted to these attacks in ways that were hard to understand. As winter began to show its sharp claws in November, something very strange happened. A shooter who was following a deer through the forest got lost in an area he didn't know, even though he had grown up with those mountains. He found a place that would stay with him for the rest of his life while he was trying to get his bearings. On a rocky outcropping, against the gray dusk sky, stood a person. Between them was too far. For clear features, but the figure's posture and the way it held what looked like a measuring tool made me think of Thomas McAllister. The hunter yelled, waved, and tried to get closer, but the ground between them was dangerous, with cracks covered by low plants. And when he finally found a way to get to the rocky peak, there was no one there. There were only marks on the ground, like someone had been there for a long time and made deep prints in the rock. And written on the rock next to it, some of the things Thomas drew in his notebook were symbols. One of them was a sharp tool and a steady hand. The hunter's story spread like flames through the mountain towns. Some people said he was making it all up because he was tired, and the twilight was making him look crazy. Others, though, believed everything he said because he wasn't known for making things up or fantasizing. He was a sober, well-liked man who had spent his whole life managing those rough areas. He saw something if he said he had seen it. The sheriff of Wise County, who was usually a realistic person who didn't believe in ghosts or secrets that couldn't be explained, chose to do something different. In the historical archives of the area, papers from his official expedition can still be found. The idea was to make a full map of the Silent Valley area, set up landmarks, and try to make sense of all the strange things that had happened that hard year. The trip began in December 1904, which was a dangerous month for mountain trips, but the sheriff wouldn't let them. They took enough food and water for 3 weeks, camping gear that could handle the extreme cold, and detailed records of all the earlier reports. The Georgetown scholar, who was now totally engrossed in the puzzle, and 2 Civil War veterans, who knew how to stay alive in the worst conditions, were among the participants. Nobody did anything bad during the first few days. They used to make maps of trails, write down information about rock formations and caves, and set up markers, methods that were available at the time. But on the 5th night, while sleeping on a rise with a view of the valley below, something happened that made everyone question their sense of reason. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the watchman who kept the fires going woke everyone up. He pointed to the valley, where a lot of small lights were moving in patterns that looked like they were following an unseen dance routine. The light from them wasn't like that from torches or regular lamps. Quality that is lighter and almost blue. The lights danced through the trees, went up and down impossible slopes, vanished, and then reappeared in different places, all without making sense. This event went on for about 40 minutes. Every person on the trip saw it and wrote about it in their own personal diaries. The scholar tried to come up with scientific answers. Gases coming from cracks in the rock, the glow of an unknown material, and crystals reflecting in the night's dampness. Fog. But no answer could fully explain what he had seen. As soon as it got light, they went down to where the lights had been seen. The plants were shook up, like something heavy had gone through them, but there were no clear tracks. There were, however, more images carved into trees that were exactly the same as the ones that had been found before. They found something that sent chills down their spines in a clearing, a perfect circle where nothing was. Grew where the ground was packed down in a way that suggested it had been used often and for a long time. The oldest soldier, who had seen the worst of war without shying away, said he was scared for the first time in decades. In that place, there was something deeply wrong, something that touched on basic survival traits that society tries to hide. He told them they had to leave right away, but the sheriff was set on finishing the job. Over the next few days, they broke up into smaller groups to go over more ground. During one of these breaks, the scholar's helper found something that changed everything that was known about the case. As he explored a cave that led into a steep cliff, he saw clear signs that people had been there recently. There were signs of sleep marks and the remains of campfires, as well as things that were clearly from the 1800s. The most interesting thing, though, was writing on the cave walls. Someone used wood from the fire, had sent messages in English, broken up phrases that talked about noticing patterns that kept happening over time and the need to record and observe. Even though the cave conditions had made the handwriting worse, people who had seen Thomas McAllister's notebook could still read it. It had been weeks since he had been seen last. The texts didn't show hopelessness or a need for help. On the contrary, they showed resolve and even interest. Thomas wrote about being able to. There was something deeply important about having found meaning in being there. I am not a prisoner. I am a witness. Some of us need to stay so that others may understand when the time comes. When the cave was found, it caused a lot of disagreement among the group members. The sheriff saw it as proof that Thomas had initially survived and could still be living somewhere in the mountains, though he might have been avoiding people because of a mental illness. Talking to people. The expert, on the other hand, saw something more complicated, a story that went beyond a man who was lost in nature. The food and a clear word that Thomas was welcome back, that no one would judge him, and that his family was waiting for him were left in the cave. They carefully marked the spot on their maps and planned to go back often to see if the food had been touched. It was the best they could do in a situation that didn't follow any normal search and rescue rules. When the group finally got back to civilization, they brought more questions than solutions. Their formal reports were put away, but copies started getting passed around among people who are interested in things that can't be explained. The case against Thomas McAllister grew into something bigger, a look into the secrets that the Appalachians held long before Europeans came, and that would continue to hold long after everyone involved had died. It was very cold in the winter of 1905 in the Appalachian Mountains, causing blizzards that cut off some towns for weeks. It became impossible to walk on the paths, and anyone who wanted to go back to the Valley of Silence would have to wait until spring. The stories about Thomas McAllister took on a life of their own during these months of being locked up against his will. They were told over and over again around family fireplaces, changing and growing with each telling. People who went to a small Methodist church near Bristol started telling the preacher about strange things that happened, things to do in the mountains. He wasn't interested in death for its own sake. He was motivated by real pastoral care. A lot of people in his community were having nightmares, feeling uneasy, and in some cases they had an irrational urge to hike to the more remote mountain areas. The minister didn't just think this was a psychological thing. He thought it was important to pay close attention to. The preacher wrote down a lot of testimonies in his notes, which are now kept in the county historical library. An old woman told the story of her late husband, a skilled hunter who went missing in the same woods 30 years before. She had never talked about it in public before, but she felt like she had to now. Before he disappeared, her husband became obsessed with a certain part of the forest. He kept going back to the same spot, saying that there was something there that needed to be understood. A different story came from a trader who often took goods across the mountains. He swore it was possible on some nights with a full moon. to hear sounds coming from the valleys that weren't from people or animals, but from something else. He said they sounded like chants or laments, echoing between the peaks in a way that made it hard to tell where they came from. His horses would get upset when they heard these sounds and refused to move forward. He had learned to accept this animal instinct. The Georgetown scholar couldn't go back to the mountains in the winter, so he spent all of his time studying older records of history. In addition to looking at colonial records in Charleston, he also went to libraries in Richmond and Williamsburg and examined archives there. What he found was a pattern that was much bigger than he had thought at first. There were many constant references to a place in the Appalachians that the first settlers called hollow ground. There was some disagreement about what that phrase really meant, but records from 1750 talk about a group of French explorers who apparently found ancient structures in that area, buildings that were built before any known European population. The stories were broken up and often conflicting, but they all had some things in common: reports of glowing things happening at night, symbols carved into stone, and threats not to disturb what lived there. A French explorer wrote that the people who lived there revered that place so much that they only went there on certain occasions and always did rituals to protect it. At the same time, Thomas's wife started getting letters in the town of Lynchburg. Letters from strangers. The letters came at random times and always had handwriting that she didn't know as the sender. The content was mysterious. It talked about cycles that were over, guardians who decided to stay, and how important it was not to mess with processes that humans couldn't understand. In one of the letters there was a clear picture of one of the mountain symbols, along with the words, "He understands now and is at peace." I gave these letters to the sheriff, and he started an investigation to find out where they came from. Postmarks showed that they were sent from several small towns spread out across the mountainous area. It didn't seem possible for one person to be traveling between all of these places in the middle of winter, unless more than one person sent the letters at the same time, or the letters were dropped off at the local post office a long time before that. When March came around, the snow started to fall. When the snow started to melt, and the paths could be used again, the sheriff set up a new expedition. The group would be smaller and more focused this time. A trusty guide and the Georgetown scholar were the only ones with him. The plan was to check the cave where Thomas's messages were found and see if anyone had touched the food that had been left there. The trip was hard because the ground was slippery from mud and streams that were swollen from melting snow blocked the normal paths. They got to the valley in 6 days. It takes twice as long to silence the area as it would normally. When they got to the cave, they were shocked to find something they hadn't seen before. The supplies were no longer there at all. Instead, things that definitely belonged to Thomas McAllister were carefully placed next to them. These included his map, pocket watch, and an extra notebook that no one knew he had. There were detailed drawings in the notebook of the mountains from points that could not be reached without climbing very dangerous peaks. There were also notes about the phases of the moon, patterns in the stars, and complicated math problems that seemed to try to figure out some kind of timeline. Another scary thing was a new writing on the cave walls that had just been added because the charcoal was still fresh. The message said, "Don't look any further. There is work here that can't be explained. Tell those who love me that I have found my place in the great mystery. I am a sentinel now, as others were before me, and as others will be after me." This made the sheriff very sad, because of the find. As a lawyer, he was used to giving clear replies and resolving cases. But here he was, facing something that wouldn't fit into any category or be solved. Thomas McAllister was clearly still living, or at least he was until not long ago. He also clearly did not want to be found or saved. It was a question of both law and morality, how to move forward. With the simple tools available at the time, The Georgetown researcher looked through Thomas's notebook for hours and took pictures of each page, carefully typing up every entry. The math figures showed that the mind had not lost its clarity, but was focused on something that no one could normally understand. It looked like Thomas was trying to draw a picture of some kind of convergence, or times when certain conditions in the mountains came together in a certain way. References to historical times were spread out over many decades, and were all marked with different symbols. The scholar checked these times against the ones he had written down for. He found a troubling link between disappearances and strange events happening in the area. Thomas marked each date with a known event, like a person going missing or reporting having strange experiences. It was like he had found a secret rhythm that controlled the mysteries of those mountains in terms of time. The guide they were with finally spoke. He was a quiet man who rarely gave advice without being asked. He talked about how his grandfather, who had died a long time ago, was one of the last natives to live in those mountains permanently before they were forced to move to lower lands. He learned about the ancients from his grandfather. These were people who lived in the mountains before Europeans, and knew how the land worked in ways that have been lost to time. These stories say that sometimes people were called by the mountains and told they were meant to be a part of something bigger. They set up camp near the cave and waited a few days to see if Thomas would come. Get in touch. They set up watch shifts so that someone was always awake and alert. Around midnight on the second night, the sheriff, who was on duty, saw something move at the edge of the area. Someone was slowly coming toward us, walking carefully through the trees. His heart was racing because he thought they were finally going to meet. The sheriff knew it wasn't Thomas McAllister as the figure came out of the darkness, though. The man was older and had a long beard. He was dressed in clothes that had been worn down by time and the weather, and a sharp look. He walked up to the flames without being afraid, like he had every right to be there. His voice was rough from not using it much, but his words were clear and well thought out. Though he had used that name in a long time, the old man said his name was Ezekiel. He did say that he sometimes wondered if he was still who he had been. He talked about how he had lived in the mountains for more than 20 years, and how he had come there looking for gold but found something much more valuable. I understand. He knew Thomas, had talked to him more than once, and brought a word that Thomas wanted to get across. The message was both very simple and very hard to understand. Thomas told his family that he was okay, that he made the right choice, and that they shouldn't have to go through any pain because of him. He had found something in the mountains that needed witnesses, people who were willing to watch and write down what they saw for longer than one lifetime. He was now part of a long line of observers who watched over. There was knowledge that couldn't be written down or sent. It had to be experienced by being there all the time. The sheriff tried to argue, talking about Thomas's duties, his family, and the world he had left behind. Ezekiel listened carefully and then gave a sad smile. He said that every point of view had been taken into account, and that the choice had not been made without much thought. People who stayed in the mountains did so not because they were crazy or wanted to escape, but because they had a hard-to-define reason to do so, to explain to those who didn't feel called. When the scholar asked Ezekiel about the patterns, the symbols, and what was really being seen, he was uncertain. In the end, he said that the mountains remembered more than just human events. They remembered much older and more basic processes as well. In some places, the line between what we know and what we don't know became less thick, letting us see facts that are usually hidden. These zones were tried to be mapped out with the symbols, when and where it became possible to have these thoughts. Ezekiel stayed with them until dawn, and told them stories about his life in the woods and other people he had met over the years who had made the same choices. He talked about how there was a fine line between human exploration and keeping mysteries alive. He said that the progress of society was scary, and that this line had been stable for hundreds of years. As the sky turned pink and gold from the sun, he got up and got ready to leave. Before I left, Ezekiel gave the sheriff a letter that was sealed and was meant for Thomas's wife. He told her that she would find words inside that only she could fully understand. He hoped that these words would help her feel some peace. Following this, he turned and walked away among the trees with the same quiet ease with which he had come. They tried to follow him, but it seemed like he just blended into the scenery, becoming a part of the forest in a way that made it impossible to find. The expedition came back to society with more artifacts and knowledge, but also the weight of knowing that some mysteries are actively hard to solve. The sheriff gave Thomas's wife the letter in person and watched as she read it alone. When she came out of the room, her eyes were red, but she had a calm, accepting look on her face. She told the sheriff she was grateful and that she could finally move on now that she knew her husband had found something that made him happy. It was formal that the case, closed in the county records as a vanishing on their own. But it was clear to those who saw the proof and heard the stories that the story was much more complicated than that. There was a physical and a psychological line that Thomas McAllister had crossed, and on the other side he had found a reason to stay. It was still up for debate and guesswork as to whether this was madness, wisdom, or something else entirely. The months that came after the official end of people who lived near the Valley of Silence went through a small but significant change because of the case. People changed the way they looked at the mountains, making them more respectful and interested, though they were aware that there was something more than the trees and rocks. The Georgetown scholar wrote a scholarly paper about what he found, worded carefully to avoid drawing conclusions that could hurt his image, but they are still causing heated arguments among intellectuals. In the spring of 1905, an unusually large number of people are visiting hilly areas. Journalists from bigger places like Richmond and even Washington, D.C., came with notebooks and simple cameras, eager to record something amazing, or at least talk to people who saw the events that were reported in sensational newspapers. People who lived there before were usually open to visitors, but now they were wary and quiet, keeping their stories and holy places safe from what they saw as unwanted eyes. One of these reporters, a woman named Margaret Harrison, who worked for a newspaper in Boston, took a different method. Instead of trying to get attention, she lived with the mountain people for weeks and earned their trust by being respectful and patient. She gathered stories that no one else had heard, stories that were only told in private moments late at night, when walls came down and greater truths could come out. Margaret was especially interested in the stories of women from the area, which were often left out of male reports. The researchers. An old weaver talked about seeing people going in the mountains at different times since she was a child. It was like she could see through time. She talked about seeing old natives, early settlers, and more recent people dressed in clothes from the 1800s, all coming together in the same places. She said they were all drawn there by something she couldn't put her finger on. Another woman, a midwife who often worked in remote areas and attended births, said something troubling. She had seen that babies born at certain times of the year, especially during times that lined up with the patterns of time that Thomas had found, people were especially sensitive to the mountains. As kids, these kids had a strong link to the land, and they often talked about seeing or hearing things that other people didn't. When these kids grew up, some of them chose to live in the most remote areas, becoming guides, hunters, or just hermits who liked being alone in the mountains more than being with other people. Margaret also talked to the pastor who spent the winter putting together the stories. To make sense of what happened in the mountains in light of his Christian faith, he came up with a complicated religious theory. He didn't see the guards as heretics or crazy, like Ezekiel and Thomas seemed to have done. Instead, he saw them as people answering a different kind of divine calling. He said they were like the prophets in the Old Testament who went into the desert to pray and think. He also said they were like monks who tried to become wise by being alone and thinking. As she did her study, Margaret also had a disturbing event happen to her. She was walking with a local guide along a well-known trail near one of the towns when she briefly lost her companion while looking at an interesting rock outcrop. She was by herself for no more than 5 minutes. However, something happened in that short time that she would have trouble explaining for the rest of her life. It looked like the air around her changed. It got thicker and brighter at the same time. She heard something that she called music, but she wasn't able to play the tune well or describe the sounds that seemed to come from the ground. For a split second, she was sure she saw clear figures moving through the trees. These were not ghosts in the usual sense. They seemed like presences from different times overlapping. She blinked when her guide called her, and everything was back to normal. This made her wonder if it had really happened or if she was just overthinking it. This event changed Margaret's life. Method to the past she was looking into. From being a skeptical person with a lot of questions, she became someone who was truly trying to understand things that didn't make sense. Her later pieces, which came out over a few months, were amazingly fair. They just told readers the facts without making any judgments, so they could come to their own conclusions. At the same time, Thomas's wife made an unexpected choice. A small house near Abington, a mountain town close to the Vale of Quiet, was where she had moved in for good. She didn't even try to look for or visit her husband, as she seemed to be following through on some unspoken deal set up by the letter she had received. However, she wanted to stay close to the place where he had chosen to stay. She set up a small shop in her house where people who were interested in hearing about Thomas could come, but only if they were respectful. The Georgetown professor who became very close with her became one of her regular visitors. Together, because they are both interested in the secrets of mountain ranges. Together, they put together a small library of records, maps, and stories about things that happened in the area. This became a collection that was later given to the local historical society. During that summer, something happened that made it seem even more like the mountains had their own rules. A group of scientists from the University of Virginia came to study the minerals that are found in the area. They were rigorous experts who were not sure. Most of the stories they had heard were only about school goals. Unfortunately, after only 1 week in the field, 3 of the 5 team members asked to go back right away and wouldn't say more than that the area was geologically unstable and could be dangerous. The 2 that were left finished the study that was supposed to be done, but their papers had strange things in them that they couldn't explain, like magnetic readings that changed a lot for no reason and rock samples that showed different results, traits when they were studied in the lab, and seismic records that showed activity below the ground that didn't match known patterns of tectonic or volcanic activity. In a private letter to the Georgetown scholar, one of the geologists said that he thought the Earth itself knew he was there and was responding subtly to his instruments and research. In August, Ezekiel came back for a short time, this time to visit Thomas's wife. A small package covered in tanned deer was in his hand, skin that had more personal items that Thomas hoped she had. He had on him his wedding ring, a picture of his family, and a necklace that belonged to his mother. Ezekiel only stayed long enough to deliver the package and say a few words. Thomas was healthy and had fully adjusted to life in the mountains. He thought of her with love and appreciation for being able to understand his choice. People in academia started to disagree about what was going on in Appalachia. Some thought it was all mass panic caused by a few people acting alone. Communities that believe in superstitions and exaggerations a lot. Some people saw trends that were too consistent to be brushed off as fantasy. An anthropologist at Yale thought that the area might have had spiritual meaning for ancient tribes, whose beliefs and practices had left a psychic mark that still affects sensitive people. Harvest time in the fall meant traditional festivals in the mountain towns. It was the first time in decades that the events had explicit acknowledgement of old stories and riddles that were a big part of what the area was known for. Elders who had been quiet about some things in the past started to share information that had been passed down from generation to generation. They did this because they knew that if they didn't, a lot would be lost when they died. As people became more open, a more complex picture of the part that places like the Valley of Silence played began to form. They were not just scary or mysterious places to be, avoided, but an important part of the way people were connected to that place. Thomas and Ezekiel were no longer sad figures lost to madness. They were now the guardians, people who were doing something important that most people couldn't understand. Since the winter of 1906 was milder than the previous one, the trails could be used for longer amounts of time. Unexpectedly, this led to a steady flow of people looking for their own answers about the mountains, each with their own reasons for doing what they do. Some went because they were interested in science, others because they were looking for spiritual answers, and still others just felt drawn to the mountains, like something was calling them by name. One of the guests was Robert Chen, a painter from Philadelphia. His family had come to America from China and worked on the railroads. When he got to the area, he planned to paint the wild beauty of the Appalachians, but he soon realized he was drawing more than that. His writings. Robert set up a temporary studio in an empty cabin near the village of Lebanon. He started to paint not only the landscape, but also the atmosphere that seemed to be permeating those places, the shadows that seemed to have more depth than they should have, the lights that seemed to suggest a presence that went beyond the visual, set up to give a wide view of the peaks from which the Valley of Silence could be seen. His drawings kept him outside all day, and over time he started to see patterns in the way the light changed and how some places seemed to be full of life at certain times. He started writing down these observations in a different journal, making a visual record of things that other people had talked about. Robert was drawing at dusk in February when he saw something that made him speechless. On the far horizon, against the darkening sky, there was a silhouette of a single person on a rocky peak. The way the person was standing, even from a long way away, made me think of deep thought, a stillness that stood out against the wildness of the vastness around it. Robert quickly drew the scene, catching the essence of that moment before it got so dark that he couldn't see anything. He gave the drawing to the Georgetown expert who was now making regular trips to the area. The scholar knew right away where the place was. It was one of the highest points in the area and could only be reached by dangerously climbing. Thomas McAllister wrote many times about this place on maps and in his notes. The chance that the person was Thomas, or maybe Ezekiel or another guardian they still didn't know, was interesting. What the picture meant, though, was more important. Making the choice to be in that impossible place and see something that no one in the lands could see. That winter, Margaret Harrison went back to the area, but this time she brought a camera with her. These people not only wrote about the places themselves, but also about the people whose lives the mountains had changed. She talked to the now growing group of people who chose to live close to the Valley of Silence. People are pulled for a wide range of reasons, from the scientific to the spiritual, from the artistic to the just plain strange. Two of these people were retired doctors from Charleston. One of them had a terrible personal tragedy. A fire killed his whole family. He went to the mountains to be alone and work through his sadness, but what he found there was something else. On calm nights, when he walked the trails at night under the stars, he felt a peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The busy towns. Not forgetting about his loss, but accepting and realizing that there were cycles and patterns bigger than one person's pain, even though that pain was still real and true. The other person who lived there was a young teacher from Boston who had read Margaret's articles and felt compelled to visit. There was no logical reason for her to have given up a good job and a comfortable life to teach kids from nearby towns in a rustic cabin. However, she was sure she was where she was supposed to be when she woke up in the morning and saw the mountains covered in fog. People who wanted to talk about the spiritual aspects of mountain phenomena started going to regular meetings led by the Methodist preacher. A wide range of people came to these talks. Traditional Christians have a hard time explaining events that don't make sense with their faith. People of other religions who find similarities in their own cosmologies, and people who aren't religious but have an interest in. A strong feeling that those places held something holy. In March 1906, during one of these talks, a visitor showed up out of the blue. He was a middle-aged man who dressed simply but with a natural air of respectability about him. He asked if he could speak, then said his name was Samuel, and that he had been a mountain guide for 15 years before coming back to normal life. His story gave me a new way to think about what it meant to take on this role, and, more importantly, what it would be like to leave it one day. Samuel said that becoming a guardian wasn't like being locked up or going crazy, but more like becoming deeply immersed in rhythms and patterns that most people don't notice. Having lived in the mountains for so long, he had become sensitive to small changes in his surroundings and had a natural sense of when and where things would happen. He also felt like he was a part of something that linked the far past to the unknown future. But in the end, he felt like he had done his job and it was time to go back and talk about what he had learned in a way that other people could understand. Many people felt better after hearing his story, especially Thomas's wife. With the thought that guards could decide to come back at some point. The door wasn't really shut, and Thomas could make that choice one day as well. After the meeting, Samuel went to see her alone and talked for a long time about Thomas, who he knew from his time as a babysitter. He told her that Thomas was truly happy and that he had found deep meaning in. He knew what his job was, but he also remembered and loved the people he had left behind. In the spring, the region's government changed. Wise County got a new sheriff. He is younger and has more modern and forward-thinking thoughts about how to improve things. He thought that the stories about the Silent Valley were holding the area back in the past and stopping growth. He started to push for more aggressive mapping trips, the building of roads that would make it easier to get to remote places, and growth that would bring about economic growth. This approach caused immediate conflict with longtime residents who saw value in keeping the mysteries and sticking to traditional limits. People in the town split into two groups, those who wanted progress and those who wanted to keep things the same. The Georgetown scholar tried to be a mediator by saying that careful growth and respect for the region's unique features could live together. However, both sides refused to agree with him. During this time, growing fear that something would happen that would drastically change the course of events. The new sheriff gave permission for a mapping expedition to go into the Silent Valley. It was made up of men who had no knowledge of or respect for local customs. Their goal was to make the valley less mysterious. They brought modern tools with them, like accurate measuring tools and better cameras for taking pictures. They were determined to show that there wasn't anything unusual about that place other than its odd geography. The trip was. Stayed away for 3 whole days. When they finally came out, 2 of the 5 had to be carried because they were in such shock that they couldn't speak clearly. The other 3 looked scared and said they would never go back to that area. Their tools had been broken for no apparent reason. The pictures were only blurry and skewed, and the measuring tools had logged wrong information before they stopped working. What happened with the mapping trip sent shockwaves through the whole country. The hilly area, starting new arguments about how far people should go exploring and how they should treat places that had clear rules. Both men went into shock and were taken to a hospital in Roanoke, where they were watched by doctors for weeks. Doctors couldn't find a physical cause for their illness, so they just said it was a serious nervous breakdown caused by an unknown traumatic event. After getting their bearings, the 3 remaining members of the trip, fragmented and often at odds with each other versions of what had happened. It was agreed upon by all that they had become very lost after entering a certain area of the Valley of Quiet. The sun seemed to be in impossible places in the sky, compasses kept spinning, and sounds came from places that didn't make sense. It was said by one of them that they had walked in a straight line for hours and then emerged back at the beginning. Another person said they saw stone buildings that shouldn't be there, which showed up and went away based on the view. The most upsetting story came from the trip leader, an experienced engineer from Baltimore who had worked on projects in rough terrain all over the eastern United States. He said that he saw people watching them from afar, never coming close but always being on the edges of their view. These people were not there when they tried to get close to them, and the second night, when they camped when he woke up, all of his instruments were neatly set up in a circle around the campfire. The symbols they had seen carved into trees were now drawn in the ground around their tents. The new sheriff's view of the Silent Valley changed completely after what happened. He went to see each of the expedition's survivors in person and listened carefully to what they had to say. Then, in April 1906, at a public meeting in Weiss's main hall, he said something that shocked everyone. He admitted that he had been cocky and had undervalued something that clearly deserved respect. He also said that there would be no more official expeditions to that area without first consulting with people who lived there or had a better understanding of the area. The group felt a lot better after this change, but it also brought up new questions about how to move forward. Why shouldn't the Valley of Silence be explored or built upon? What should be done with it? What should be done to keep the area safe and keep people from entering it without meaning to? At the time, the Georgetown scholar suggested making a preservation zone, which was something that had never been done before. This would be an area that would be officially recognized as having special significance and where entry would be controlled not by complete ban, but by education and respect. There was a lot of disagreement about the plan. Some people thought it was a smart way to respect the mysteries and keep everyone safe. Those claimed that any kind of official regulation would not be able to handle something that went beyond what the government normally understands. Some people also thought that making the place more official would bring in even more unwanted attention from people who wanted to make a story or make money off of it. While these arguments went on, Margaret Harrison was writing a big book about her studies and experiences in the area. It took her more than a year to gather. She was looking at documents, telling stories, and trying to make a story that would do the complicated things she was writing down honor. It was hard for her to tell the truth about the facts in a way that didn't make fun of real situations or lie about things to make them seem more dramatic. What they found was released in 1907 and became a key resource for anyone interested in the mysteries of the Appalachians. Painting artist Robert Chen had finished a large body of work showing, see the mountains at different times of the year and in different light. Something intangible was caught in his paintings, making people feel like they could almost see what was beneath the surface. When he showed these works in a shop in Richmond, people were blown away. People said the pictures moved them strongly, and some said they had intense emotional experiences after thinking about them for long periods of time. A very insightful review from a New York art reviewer said that Chen's paintings were like doorsway, windows that let people understand things that are hard to put into words. Speaking about places like the Valley of Silence, he said that maybe art was a better way to get some truths across than scientific or journalistic methods alone, because they were limited when dealing with things that were outside of what could be normally measured or spoken. In the summer of 1906, Samuel, the guardian who had gone back to normal life, started to offer something special. There were guided tours for people who really wanted to learn about the mountains in a proper way. These were not irrational trips for people who were just interested. They were carefully planned trips for people who were emotionally and spiritually ready for them. Samuel took small groups of no more than 3 people to places where the phenomena were easiest to see. He taught them how to watch, listen, and be present in ways that helped them understand things more deeply. The people who took part in these journeys came back, changed in small but important ways. They didn't say they had seen miracles or had big breakthroughs, but they did talk about shifting their views and getting in touch with parts of life that modern life tends to hide. One person who took part, a university history professor, said she felt like she was in direct touch with deep time and could feel the presence of all the generations that had walked those paths before her. That would follow. Thomas's wife became an important person in this new group of people who were interested in the mysteries of the mountains. People who had just moved to the area could learn from those who had lived there longer at her Abington home, where stories were told and newbies could socialize. She kept in touch with people all over the country who had been moved by the stories through regular letters, building a web of connections that went beyond the unique geography of the North Carolina. In her letters, she often wrote about what sacrifice and meaning mean. She realized that Thomas's choice wasn't an escape from reality or a way to avoid responsibility. Instead, she saw it as a response to a calling that some people receive, a call to a role that serves a bigger purpose, even if that purpose is unknown to those on the outside. She said that the guardians were like monks in remote monasteries, artists who are driven by the need to share their visions, and anyone who picks a path that other people find hard to understand, but is absolutely important for them. An interesting visitor came in the fall. Franz Bauer, a German anthropologist who was famous around the world for studying cultures on every continent and coming up with ideas about places of power, which were places that people from all over the world saw as having special powers. He came to the Valley of Silence specifically to look at it as part of his comparative study. He wanted to find out if the things people had said were true. Things were like that in other parts of the world. Bauer spent 3 months in the area, where he did in-depth interviews, looked at papers, went on Samuel's guided tours, and made his own careful observations. Even though he came to his conclusions with all the intellectual care that was needed, they were very new at the time. He said that there were places in the world where geological, magnetic, and maybe even other forces that we don't fully understand all came together to make conditions that helped change how people perceived things. Instead of being abnormal or deceptive, these experiences might have been real human abilities that were hidden from most people and situations. Bauer also said something more controversial. He said that some people might naturally be more sensitive to these conditions, and that the guardian tradition was a way of preserving ancestral knowledge about how to deal with these places in a healthy way. He said that the Appalachian guardians were like practitioners of different spiritual groups from around the world who played similar roles. They acted as go-betweens for people in parts of reality that most people couldn't see. His ideas caused heated arguments in the scholarly world. Some of his co-workers said he had given up on scientific rigor in favor of faith, while others said he was just being honest about the limits of what we know now and leaving the door open for more research. No matter how his work was received in academia, new credibility to the Appalachian phenomena, turning them from strange stories from the American frontier into something to seriously talk about. As the last few weeks of 1906 came to a close, there was a strong feeling that the region's relationship with its secrets had changed in many important ways. What started out as a case of a person going missing turned into a group investigation into consciousness, perception, meaning, and the limits of what we think is real or possible. People still lived in the woods where Thomas McAllister lived, but his absence had turned into a different kind of presence. one that sparked changes that would last for decades. The years that followed brought about a deep but quiet change in that part of the Appalachians. The Valley of Quiet stayed the same, unaffected by the changes that were happening quickly in other parts of the country. Communities in the area. The people there learned to live with the mystery and value it as an important part of who they were, just like the mountains that were all around them. Thomas McAllister never went back to normal life. His wife spent the rest of her life in that house in Abington, where she kept a quiet watch. She never questioned his decision and never felt bad about the way their lives had gone. She sometimes got clues that he was still living in the Heights, like small objects left in certain places or messages sent from him. He continued to carry out whatever cause he had found in the depths of the mountains through people like Ezekiel and Samuel. As time went on, stories about the guardians were passed down from one generation to the next. Each story keeps bits of truth while adding new levels of meaning and interpretation. As kids, they heard stories about the surveyor who turned into a guardian, the faces on the rocks, and the lights that danced in the valleys at night. Some of these young people, when people became adults, they all felt the same mysterious calling. That strong pull to faraway places where the lines between worlds seemed to be the smallest. In the end, the Georgetown scholar released a huge academic work that carefully recorded everything he had learned about the area. His book became a standard for people who were interested in things that didn't fit neatly into any one category. It is required reading for anyone who wants to know how certain places can have a big effect on people. Being aware. He never said he knew the answers for sure. He just said he had asked the right questions and written down what he saw. For the rest of her career, Margaret Harrison kept writing about mysteries and strange events that no one could explain. But she always came back to the Appalachians as an example of how being humble in the face of the unknown could be more useful than being sure of something too soon. Her words have taught generations of detectives to treat riddles with respect instead of, to see that not everything that is real can be easily measured or described is not arrogant skepticism. Some of Robert Chen's paintings are in important collections because they clearly preserve things that words alone could not. People who had never been to the Appalachians felt like they could hear what the locals were saying when they looked at his paintings. It was like the pictures gave people a sense of the places they showed. Parts of their essence were moved to the canvas by the artist's careful look. During the area around those mountains has changed a lot over the years. Cities grew, technology got better, and old ways of life were swapped out for new ones. The Valley of Silence, on the other hand, didn't change much. It was protected by its rough terrain and by an unspoken deal among people who knew how special it was. Some people made it their pilgrimage, while others avoided it, but everyone knew it was a place where normal rules did not fully apply. Some people say that even now, on clear nights when conditions are. In the right way, you can see lone people on the highest peaks. Watching something that most people can't see are silent guardians. It's impossible to say for sure if Thomas McAllister is among them, or if he still walks those trails after all these years. But the chance lives on in late-night whispers and stories that won't go away. We are sure that some places hold secrets that can't be explained in easy terms, that there are riddles that refuse to be solved because maybe you shouldn't try to solve them. The story of Thomas McAllister shows us that the real world is bigger and weirder than we think, that there are places on the edges of what we know where the strange becomes normal, and the impossible just is. The Appalachian Mountains keep getting higher into the sky. Their hills are covered with old forests. Their slopes hide the memories of all the people who have walked their paths over the years. And between these hills there may still be sentinels. Keep watch, carrying out the roles they have chosen. Guards of borders that don't show up on maps, but are as real as stone and earth. For the most part, This is the story of Thomas McAllister that we can tell. The whole truth is still up there in the heights, waiting for someone brave or cold enough to go find it. They should know that if they do, they might decide to stay and become part of the mystery they came to solve. You might like this trip through the secrets of the mountains. Tell us what you think in the comments. If you subscribe, you'll get more scary and dark stories that make us question what we think we know about the world. Until the next trip into the wild.